An elderly man was describing how his daughter had brought him to the emergency room for chest pains, then disappeared while he was being admitted, leaving him alone for 3 days without a word. The comments were filled with shock and outrage. How could anyone abandon their own father in a hospital? What kind of monster leaves a sick elderly parent alone like that? What made my blood run cold wasn't just the cruelty of his story. It was that I was reading it while sitting in this same hospital bed where my own daughter Jessica had walked out on me 6 hours ago, claiming she'd be right back after I was admitted for a stroke. But here's what Jessica didn't know when she abandoned her 70-year-old mother in room 247 of St. Mary's Medical Center. I wasn't just some helpless old woman she could discard when I became inconvenient. I was the woman who still controlled the trust fund that had been paying for her luxury lifestyle for the past 5 years. A trust fund worth $800,000 that she thought was guaranteed inheritance. Let me tell you how I went from being a patient, abandoned in a hospital bed, to the one holding all the financial power. It all started 8 months ago when my daughter Jessica called me in tears from her home in Beverly Hills. "Mom, I'm in crisis," she sobbed into the phone. "Richard's business is failing, and we're about to lose everything. The house, the cars, Sophia's private school tuition, everything we've worked for." I had been living comfortably in my senior community in Scottsdale, Arizona, enjoying my book club, weekly bridge tournaments, and volunteer work at the animal shelter. At 70, after my husband Frank's death 3 years prior, I thought my days of financial rescuing were behind me. But hearing the desperation in Jessica's voice, the same voice that used to call me crying over scraped knees and broken hearts, I couldn't turn my back on her. "How bad is it, sweetheart?" I asked, already mentally calculating the assets I could access from Frank's carefully structured estate. "We need $200,000 to save the house and keep Sophia in Westmont Academy," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "Mom, I hate asking, but you're the only person who can help us. Sophia would be devastated if she had to leave her friends and start over at a public school. My granddaughter Sophia, brilliant, ambitious 16-year-old who dreamed of studying medicine at Stanford. I'd been living in Arizona for 2 years, seeing her only during holidays and summer visits, always feeling like I was missing too much of her teenage years. The thought of her losing her educational opportunities because of her father's business failures broke my heart. "Don't worry, Jessica," I told her. "Family takes care of family." Within 2 weeks, I had restructured my entire financial portfolio. Frank had left me well provided for, but most of my assets were tied up in retirement accounts and conservative investments. To access the $200,000 Jessica needed quickly, I had to liquidate several long-term CDs and cash out a portion of my IRA, paying substantial penalties. But I wasn't naive. Frank had been a successful attorney who had taught me to always protect myself legally. So I had my estate lawyer, Margaret Chen, set up a family trust that would provide Jessica with a monthly allowance of $5,000 while preserving the principal for Sophia's future education and my own long-term care needs. "Mom, this is so formal," Jessica said when Margaret explained the trust structure during our video call. "Can't you just transfer the money directly?" "Jessica, this protects everyone," I explained. "You get the monthly support you need, Sophia's college fund is secured, and I maintain some control over the family assets. It's what your father would have wanted." Jessica seemed reluctant, but eventually agreed. "I suppose it makes sense from a tax perspective," she said. "And honestly, having a guaranteed monthly income might be better than a lump sum that Richard could potentially lose in another failed venture." The trust was established with clear terms. Jessica would receive $5,000 monthly for living expenses, with the understanding that the principal would eventually be split between Jessica and Sophia when I passed away. I retained the right to modify or revoke the trust at any time, though I never mentioned this detail to Jessica. For the first few months, everything seemed to work beautifully. Jessica would call every week, updating me on Richard's new business venture, some kind of tech startup. Sophia's academic achievements, and their gratitude for my support. They sent photos of family dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, and Sophia's academic awards ceremonies. "Mom, you're literally saving our family," Jessica said during one of our Sunday calls. "Richard's new company is gaining investors, and we should be back on our feet within the year. This trust fund is just buying us the time we need." But then, subtle changes began. The weekly calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When I did speak to Jessica, she seemed distracted, often cutting conversations short because she was running late for something important. Sophia, who used to grab the phone to chat with me about her classes and friends, was always busy with homework or out with friends when I called. "Is everything all right?" I asked during one particularly brief conversation in March. "You sound stressed, and I haven't spoken to Sophia in weeks." "Everything's fine, Mom," Jessica said quickly. "We're just busy with our lives here. You know how it is: work, school activities, social commitments. We appreciate the trust fund support, but we don't want you to feel like you need to micromanage our lives." Micromanage? I was simply trying to maintain a relationship with my daughter and granddaughter. When I suggested visiting for Sophia's upcoming science fair, Jessica hesitated. "Actually, Mom, this isn't the best time. Sophia's really stressed about college applications, and having house guests would just add pressure. Maybe during summer break?" Summer break came and went without an invitation. When I brought up visiting for Sophia's 17th birthday, there was another excuse. They were planning a small family celebration. Richard's parents were visiting from back east. Sophia wanted a simple party with just friends. I started to feel like I was being managed rather than loved. Every conversation felt scripted, like Jessica was giving me just enough information to keep the trust fund payments flowing without actually letting me into their lives. It wasn't until I had my stroke that I discovered the truth about what my financial generosity had really bought me. I was working in my garden on a Tuesday morning in October when the left side of my body suddenly went numb. I managed to call 911 before collapsing, and the paramedics rushed me to St. Mary's Medical Center in Phoenix. The emergency room doctors confirmed that I'd had a mild stroke. Scary, but with quick treatment and rehabilitation, I should make a full recovery. They wanted to keep me for observation for at least 48 hours to monitor for complications. I called Jessica from my hospital bed, expecting her to immediately book a flight to Phoenix. "Oh my God, Mom, are you okay?" she said, sounding genuinely concerned. "I'm stable, but I'm scared, Jessica. The doctors say I should recover completely, but I'm alone here, and I really need my family right now. Of course, I'll be on the next flight. Don't worry about anything. Just focus on getting better." Jessica arrived the next evening, and for a brief moment, I felt relief at seeing my daughter walk into my hospital room. She hugged me carefully, avoiding the IV lines, and sat beside my bed holding my hand. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Better now that you're here. The doctors say I can probably go home tomorrow if my tests look good, but I'll need help for a few weeks during recovery." "Don't worry about anything. We'll figure it out." That night, Jessica slept in the reclining chair next to my bed, and I felt grateful that despite our recent distance, she was there when I truly needed her. But the next morning brought a conversation that shattered every assumption I'd had about our relationship. "Mom," Jessica said, glancing around the hospital room as if checking for eavesdroppers, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I'm concerned about your ability to live independently after this stroke. Jessica, the doctor said I should make a full recovery. I might need some physical therapy, but Mom, you're 70 years old, you live alone, and you just had a stroke. What if it happens again? What if next time you can't call for help? Are you suggesting I move to assisted living? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to consider making some changes to ensure your safety and our family's financial security." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What kind of changes?" Jessica pulled out a folder that I hadn't noticed her carrying. "I've been consulting with an elder care attorney in Los Angeles. Given your recent health scare, it might be wise to transfer control of your assets to someone who can manage them more effectively. Jessica, what are you talking about? Mom, the trust fund you set up is great for monthly expenses, but it doesn't address the bigger picture. If you have another stroke, if you develop dementia, if you need expensive long-term care, the family needs more financial flexibility to handle those situations. I stared at my daughter, trying to process what she was suggesting. You want me to give you control of my entire estate? I want us to make smart decisions while you're still mentally competent to make them. The elder care attorney says that if we establish a comprehensive financial power of attorney now, it will protect everyone if your health deteriorates. And if my health doesn't deteriorate? Jessica's expression shifted slightly. Mom, you just had a stroke. The statistics for repeat strokes are concerning. We need to be realistic about your prognosis. I felt like I was hearing my daughter clearly for the first time in months. This wasn't about my well-being. This was about money. Jessica, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any major financial decisions while I'm lying in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke. Her response revealed everything I needed to know about her true priorities. Mom, this is exactly the kind of thinking that worries me. You're not being rational about your situation. The doctors may be optimistic, but strokes often signal declining cognitive function. The fact that you can't see the wisdom in proper estate planning suggests that your judgment might already be compromised. I stared at her in disbelief. My daughter was essentially arguing that disagreeing with her financial demands was evidence of cognitive decline. Jessica, I think you should go home. I need some time to process everything that's happened. Mom, I'm trying to help you. Don't you want your family to be taken care of? I want my family to care about me as a person, not just as a source of money. Jessica's face hardened. That's unfair. Everything I'm suggesting is for your own good. Then, why does it feel like everything you're suggesting benefits you financially? Mom, you're being paranoid. This stroke has clearly affected your thinking more than the doctors realize. And there it was. The moment I realized that my daughter saw my medical emergency not as a crisis requiring family support, but as an opportunity to seize control of my finances. Jessica, I'd like you to leave now. Fine. But Mom, when you're ready to have a rational conversation about planning for your future, call me. She gathered her purse and the legal documents she'd brought, kissed my forehead in a way that felt more like a dismissal than affection, and walked out of my hospital room. I'll be back in a few hours after you've had time to think clearly, she called over her shoulder. That was 18 hours ago. As I sat in my hospital bed, scrolling through that support group forum and reading about other elderly people abandoned by their families, I realized something important. Jessica hadn't come to Phoenix to support me through a medical crisis. She had come to exploit my vulnerability to gain control of my money, and when I refused to cooperate, she had simply left. But what Jessica didn't understand was that her abandonment had just given me the clarity I needed to make some very important decisions about my financial future. Decisions that would ensure she never had the opportunity to exploit my generosity again. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was discovering my daughter's true nature while lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that monitored every beat of my recovering heart. 24 hours earlier, I had been Margaret Eleanor Maggie Sullivan, a woman who prided herself on having raised a successful, loving daughter. Now I was beginning to understand that I might have been living a carefully constructed lie for years. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand how a woman who thought she knew her own child could be so thoroughly deceived. Frank. And I had married young. I was barely 22 when we said our vows in the little Presbyterian church in Flagstaff where I'd grown up. Frank was 4 years older, already establishing himself as a criminal defense attorney with big dreams. And an even bigger heart. We waited 8 years before trying for children. wanting to be financially stable and emotionally ready for the responsibility of raising a family. When Jessica finally arrived in 1978, she was everything we'd dreamed of and more. A beautiful, intelligent baby who grew into a curious, ambitious child. Frank used to joke that Jessica had inherited his argumentative nature and my stubborn streak, a combination that would either make her a formidable lawyer or get her into serious trouble. As it turned out, he was right on both counts. Jessica excelled at everything she touched. Straight A's throughout elementary and high school, captain of the debate team, valedictorian of her graduating class. She had scholarship offers from several prestigious universities, but she chose UCLA for their pre-law program, determined to follow in her father's footsteps. Frank and I were so proud. We'd managed to raise a daughter who was not only academically gifted, but also seemed to have a strong moral compass. She volunteered at the local animal shelter throughout high school, organized food drives for homeless families, and spent her summers working at a legal aid clinic instead of lounging by pools like her classmates. "She's going to change the world," Frank used to say, watching Jessica prepare for mock trial competitions or studying late into the night. "Mark my words, Maggie. Our daughter is going to make a real difference." I believed him completely. Jessica's college years were a whirlwind of achievements. Dean's List every semester, internships at prestigious law firms, leadership positions in student government. She seemed to have found her tribe among other ambitious pre-law students, and her confidence grew with each success. It was during her junior year at UCLA that she met Richard Blackwood. I still remember the phone call when she told me about him. Her voice had a breathless quality I'd never heard before as she described this incredibly sophisticated senior who was studying business and came from old money in Newport Beach. "Mom, he's different from all the other guys here," she gushed. "He's mature, he has real plans for his future, and his family owns this amazing house right on the water. You and Dad are going to love him." Frank and I were cautiously optimistic. Jessica had dated throughout high school and college, but she'd never sounded so smitten. When she brought Richard home for Thanksgiving that year, we understood why. Richard Blackwood was undeniably charming. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident ease that comes from growing up wealthy. He spoke knowledgeably about art, wine, and travel. He asked Frank thoughtful questions about his legal practice, and complimented me extensively on everything from my cooking to my interior decorating. "Your daughter is remarkable, Mrs. Sullivan," he said as I served dessert. "She's the most intelligent, driven woman I've ever met. You should be incredibly proud." Frank and I exchanged pleased glances. It was clear that Richard genuinely admired Jessica's accomplishments and ambition. But there were small things that nagged at me, even then. The way Richard seemed to automatically expect to be served first at dinner. How he mentioned the cost of things, his watch, his car, the wine he'd brought, in ways that felt like casual bragging rather than conversation. The subtle way he steered discussions away from Jessica's achievements and toward his own family's social connections and business ventures. "He's a little full of himself," Frank said, after Richard and Jessica had gone out for the evening. "He's young," I replied, though I'd noticed the same thing. "And he's clearly been raised with privilege. That's not necessarily a character flaw." "No, but the way he talks about money concerns me. Everything's about status and appearances." "Jessica's smart, Frank. If there were real problems with his character, she'd see them. That was my first mistake, assuming that intelligence protects you from manipulation. I was about to learn that some of the smartest people make the worst relationship choices because they overthink themselves into ignoring obvious red flags. Jessica and Richard's relationship progressed quickly. By her senior year, they were talking about marriage. Jessica had been accepted to several top-tier law schools, but she was increasingly torn about her future plans. "Richard thinks I should take a gap year after graduation," she told us during one of our weekly phone calls. "He's starting this new business venture, and he wants us to spend the year traveling and exploring opportunities together, before I commit to 3 years of law school." Frank's expression darkened. "Jessica, you've worked your entire life toward law school. Are you really going to put that on hold for a boyfriend's business venture?" "It's not just any business venture, Dad. Richard's developing a luxury travel app that connects affluent travelers with exclusive experiences. He has investors lined up, and he thinks it could be worth millions." "And what would your role be in this venture?" I asked. "I'd handle the legal aspects, contract negotiations, corporate structure. It would actually be great experience for when I do go to law school." Frank and I were concerned, but Jessica was 21 years old and had always made excellent decisions. We trusted her judgment, even when our instincts suggested caution. "Just promise me you'll only defer law school for 1 year," Frank said. "Don't let a business opportunity, no matter how promising, derail your long-term career goals." "I promise, Dad. This is just a temporary detour." That temporary detour lasted 5 years. Richard's business ventures, and there were several of them, never quite achieved the success he projected. The luxury travel app failed to gain investors. The boutique wine importing business ran into regulatory problems. The artisanal food truck franchise lost money from the start. But somehow, Richard always had another opportunity on the horizon, another revolutionary idea that just needed a little more time and capital to succeed. And Jessica. Brilliant Jessica, who had once been destined for law school and a career changing. The world gradually transformed into Richard's unpaid business partner, handling legal research, contract negotiations, and increasingly, damage control when his ventures failed. "I'm learning so much," she would tell us during our visits to Los Angeles, where they'd moved into an expensive apartment in Beverly Hills that seemed far beyond what their failed businesses could afford. "Richard's teaching me about entrepreneurship, about taking calculated risks. Law school will always be there, but opportunities like this are rare." Frank grew increasingly frustrated with each failed business venture and delayed law school application. "She's wasting her potential," he would say after we'd return home from visits. "That boy is using her intelligence to enable his delusions of grandeur." "She's an adult, Frank. We raised her to make her own choices. We raised her to make smart choices." Following Richard from one failed business to another isn't smart, it's enabling. But what could we do? Jessica seemed happy, even as her dreams of law school faded into vague someday plans. She and Richard lived well, traveled frequently, and seemed to have an active social life among Los Angeles's young professional crowd. It wasn't until they announced their engagement that Frank and I realized how completely Richard had restructured Jessica's priorities. "We're thinking of a destination wedding," Jessica said during a family dinner at our house in Scottsdale. "Richard's parents have connections at this amazing resort in Cabo, and they're willing to help with the expenses." "That sounds lovely," I said, though privately I wondered how Richard's parents were funding an expensive destination wedding when their son's businesses kept failing. "The thing is," Jessica continued, "we'll need to keep the guest list small because of the cost and logistics. Probably just immediate family and our closest friends." Frank looked up from his dinner. "Jessica, your mother and I have been saving for your wedding since you were born. We can help with expenses if you want to have a larger celebration." "Oh, Dad, that's so sweet. But Richard's family prefers to handle these things themselves. They have specific vendors they work with, traditions they want to maintain. It's easier if we just let them manage the planning." I felt a pang of disappointment. I had dreamed of planning my daughter's wedding with her, of being involved in choosing flowers and dresses and menus. But Jessica seemed eager to defer to Richard's family's preferences in all things. The wedding, when it happened 6 months later, was indeed beautiful. Richard's parents had spared no expense in creating an elegant beachfront celebration. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching my daughter marry into a family rather than starting her own. After the wedding, Jessica and Richard's lifestyle seemed to become even more expensive. They moved into a house in Beverly Hills. That must have cost at least $8,000 a month in rent. Jessica's social media was filled with photos from expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley, and designer clothing. "How are they affording this?" Frank asked after Jessica had posted photos from what appeared to be a very expensive European vacation. "Richard's food truck business failed 3 months ago. Maybe his family is helping them," I suggested, though I was wondering the same thing. "Maggie, successful people don't just give their adult children unlimited money to live like celebrities. There's something we're not being told." Frank was right, but it took Sophia's birth 2 years later for us to understand the true scope of Richard's financial irresponsibility. When Jessica called to tell us she was pregnant, she sounded simultaneously elated and stressed. "Richard and I are over the moon," she said. "But honestly, Mom, the timing is complicated. Richard's new venture capital firm is just getting off the ground, and we're not sure about our insurance situation." "What do you mean, not sure about your insurance situation?" "Well, Richard's been working as an independent consultant while he builds his client base, so we don't have traditional employer benefits. We're looking into private insurance, but it's expensive, especially with pregnancy coverage." Frank and I exchanged concerned looks. "Jessica, you're 6 months pregnant, and you don't have health insurance?" "We have catastrophic coverage, but it doesn't include prenatal care or delivery costs. Richard thinks we can work something out. With the hospital, maybe set up a payment plan." The idea of my daughter giving birth without proper medical coverage was unthinkable. Frank and I immediately offered to pay for private insurance that would cover the remainder of her pregnancy and delivery. "You don't have to do that, Dad. We'll figure something out." "Jessica, this is our grandchild we're talking about. We want to make sure you have the best possible medical care." When Sophia was born, she was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the most alert, curious eyes I'd ever seen on a newborn. Holding my granddaughter for the first time, I felt a love so fierce it took my breath away. But even in those first precious moments, I noticed troubling signs about Jessica and Richard's financial situation. The private room we'd paid for was filled with expensive baby gear, a designer stroller that cost more than most people's monthly rent, organic cotton clothes with price tags still attached, a diaper bag that I later learned cost $800. Richard wanted to make sure Sophia had the best of everything, Jessica explained when I commented on the elaborate setup. He said she deserves to start life surrounded by quality. Quality that they apparently couldn't afford, since we'd had to pay for her medical insurance. Over Sophia's first few years, this pattern continued. Richard's business ventures came and went. A cryptocurrency trading platform, a boutique fitness studio, a craft beer brewing operation. Each one required initial investment, promised dramatic returns, and ultimately failed, leaving Richard scrambling to find the next opportunity. But somehow, they maintained their expensive lifestyle. Sophia attended a prestigious private preschool that cost $2,000 a month. They lived in increasingly expensive neighborhoods. Jessica's wardrobe suggested unlimited shopping budgets. "How are they doing this?" Frank asked during one of our visits, after we'd watched Richard casually order a $300 bottle of wine at dinner. He hasn't had a successful business venture in 5 years. Maybe his family is more generous than we realized. Maggie, even generous families have limits. Something doesn't add up. Frank's suspicions proved prescient when Jessica called us in tears 3 years ago to tell us that Richard's parents had cut off all financial support. They said Richard needed to learn to stand on his own feet, she sobbed. "They're not paying for Sophia's school anymore. They're not helping with the house rent, nothing. They said we've become too dependent on their money." "Jessica, maybe this is a good thing," I said gently. "Maybe it will motivate Richard to find stable employment instead of chasing get-rich-quick schemes." "Mom, you don't understand. Richard's not built for traditional employment. He's an entrepreneur, a visionary. Working for someone else would crush his creative spirit." I bit my tongue to keep from pointing out that his creative spirit had produced nothing but failed businesses and mounting debt. What are you going to do? We're looking at all our options. Richard thinks he can get investors for his new project, AE sustainable fashion line that uses recycled materials. He just needs some bridge financing to get through the development phase. Bridge financing. I was beginning to recognize Richard's euphemisms for someone else's money to fund my lifestyle while I pursue unrealistic business ideas. That conversation happened 6 months before Jessica's desperate phone call about losing the house and Sophia's school tuition. Now, lying in this hospital bed, I was finally understanding the timeline. Richard's parents had cut them off 3 years ago. For the past 3 years, Jessica and Richard had been living on credit, borrowing against their future, maxing out cards and loans to maintain their Beverly Hills lifestyle. When that house of cards finally collapsed, Jessica had turned to the one source of money she thought she could manipulate: her loving, generous mother. The woman who had raised her, supported her dreams, paid for her wedding, covered her medical expenses, and been a devoted grandmother to Sophia. The woman lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a stroke, who had just been abandoned because she refused to hand over control of her life savings. As I processed this realization, my phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking Jessica had decided to return. The message was from Richard. "Maggie, Jessica told me about your conversation yesterday. I think there might have been some misunderstandings. When you're feeling better, we should talk about what's best for the family. Hope you're recovering well." Not Jessica. Richard. Richard, who had never texted me directly in the 15 years I'd known him. Richard, who was now reaching out to clarify misunderstandings about my financial decisions. I stared at that message for several minutes, finally, understanding something that had taken me 70 years to learn. When people show you who they really are, believe them. Jessica and Richard had shown me exactly who they were when they left me alone in this hospital bed after I refused to give them control of my money. Now it was time for me to show them who I really was, a woman who had spent 45 years married to one of Arizona's most successful attorneys, a woman who understood contracts, trusts, and legal protections, a woman who had every right to decide how her own money would be used, and most importantly, a woman who was done being anyone's financial safety net. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Margaret Chen's number. Margaret had been our family attorney for over 20 years. She'd handled Frank's estate, set up Jessica's trust fund, and had always been someone I could trust for honest legal advice. It was time to make some changes to that trust fund, changes that would ensure Jessica and Richard never had the opportunity to exploit my generosity or abandon me again. Margaret Chen answered her phone on the second ring, despite it being 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. That was one of the things I'd always appreciated about our family attorney. She understood that legal emergencies didn't operate on business hours. "Maggie, how are you feeling? I heard about your stroke from your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, when she called about updating her will. She was very concerned. I'm recovering well, thank you. Margaret, I need to discuss some changes to Jessica's trust fund. Are you available to meet tomorrow?" There was a brief pause. "Of course. Is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything is fine. Actually, everything is clearer than it's been in years. Can you come to the hospital? Or should I wait until I'm discharged?" "I can come to you. Maggie, can you give me a general idea of what kind of changes you're considering?" I looked around my hospital room, at the empty chair where Jessica had slept the night before she abandoned me, at the untouched flowers that well-meaning neighbors had sent, at the medical equipment monitoring my recovery from a stroke my own daughter had used as an opportunity to try to steal my life savings. I want to revoke the trust entirely. The silence on Margaret's end stretched for several seconds. "Maggie, that's a significant decision. Are you sure you're feeling well enough to make major financial choices right now? Sometimes after a medical event, people can feel emotional and make decisions they later regret." I had expected this response. Margaret was a good lawyer precisely because she protected her clients from making impulsive decisions during vulnerable moments. Margaret, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. But I understand your concern. What if I scheduled a competency evaluation with Dr. Patterson to demonstrate that my cognitive function is unimpaired? That's actually not a bad idea, given the circumstances. Maggie, can you tell me what's prompted this decision? I spent the next 20 minutes telling Margaret everything. Jessica's abandonment at the hospital, the attempted financial manipulation, Richard's inappropriate text message, and my growing realization that the trust fund had been enabling a lifestyle of irresponsibility and entitlement. Good God, Maggie. I'm so sorry. When I set up that trust, Jessica seemed genuinely grateful for your generosity. She was grateful for my money. There's a difference. There certainly is. Maggie, I'll be there tomorrow morning at 10. In the meantime, I want you to document everything you've told me. Write down the exact conversations you had with Jessica, save Richard's text message, and make notes about any other concerning behaviors you've observed. Why? Because if Jessica or Richard challenge your decision to revoke the trust, we'll need evidence that your choice was based on their specific actions, not on medical impairment or family conflicts. The more documentation we have, the stronger your position. After Margaret hung up, I spent the evening writing everything down. Every conversation, every manipulation tactic, every red flag I'd ignored over the years. As I wrote, patterns emerged that I'd been too loving, or too naive, to see before. The way Jessica had gradually reduced contact after the trust fund was established, as if maintaining our relationship was now optional since the money was guaranteed. How she'd consistently deflected my attempts to visit or spend time with Sophia, always having elaborate excuses that kept me at arm's length. The subtle way she'd begun talking about my age and health, planting seeds about my declining capacity, months before my stroke even happened. Richard's increasing involvement in conversations about my finances, despite having no legal relationship to me whatsoever. Most disturbing of all, I realized that Jessica's crisis phone call 8 months ago hadn't been a desperate daughter reaching out to her mother in a time of need. It had been a calculated manipulation designed to extract money from someone she saw as a reliable source of funding. The next morning, Dr. Williams made his rounds early, checking my vital signs and reviewing my progress. Mrs. Sullivan, your recovery has been remarkable. Your speech is clear, your motor function has returned to normal, and your cognitive tests show no impairment whatsoever. I think we can discharge you this afternoon. Dr. Williams, I need to ask you something. Yesterday, my daughter suggested that my stroke might have affected my judgment and decision-making abilities. Is there any medical basis for that concern? Dr. Williams looked puzzled. Not in your case. Your stroke was relatively minor and didn't affect the areas of your brain responsible for executive function or judgment. Your mental capacity is completely intact. Why do you ask? I'm making some important financial decisions, and I want to make sure I'm medically cleared to do so. Mrs. Sullivan, based on your medical condition and my evaluation, you have full capacity to make any decisions about your affairs. If anyone suggests otherwise, they're either misinformed about stroke recovery or they have motivations that aren't medical. When Margaret arrived at 10, she brought a court reporter and a video camera. I want to create an absolutely bulletproof record of your mental state and decision-making process, she explained. We're going to document this meeting thoroughly. Margaret spent an hour asking me detailed questions about my financial situation, my relationship with Jessica, and my reasons for revoking the trust. She asked about dates, specific conversations, and the timeline of events leading to my decision. Mrs. Sullivan, in your opinion, has your daughter Jessica demonstrated the responsibility and judgment necessary to manage significant financial assets? No, she has not. Jessica has shown me that she views family relationships as transactional. She maintains contact when she needs money, and withdraws when she doesn't get what she wants. She's enabled her husband's financially irresponsible behavior for 15 years, and she's attempted to manipulate my medical emergency for financial gain. Are you making this decision based on anger or hurt feelings? I'm making this decision based on evidence. Jessica abandoned me in a hospital bed because I refused to give her control of my money. That's not anger talking. That's a rational response to being shown exactly where I rank in her priorities. Do you understand the financial impact of revoking this trust? Yes. Jessica will no longer receive $5,000 monthly payments. The principal amount of approximately $800,000 will revert to my control. I understand that this decision is legally binding and financially significant. Do you have any concerns about your granddaughter Sophia's welfare? This was the question I'd been dreading. I love Sophia deeply, and I want her to have every opportunity for success. However, I've come to realize that enabling her parents' irresponsible behavior isn't actually helping her. Sophia needs to see that actions have consequences, that family relationships require mutual respect, and that financial security comes from responsible choices, not from manipulating elderly relatives. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's a very thoughtful answer. We spent another hour reviewing the legal mechanics of trust revocation and setting up new financial structures that would protect my assets while still allowing me to support causes and people I cared about, on my terms, not anyone else's. Maggie, I have to ask, what are you planning to do with the assets once they're back under your control? I'm going to live comfortably, travel if I want to, and support charities that matter to me. I'm also going to establish a separate educational fund for Sophia that Jessica and Richard cannot access or control. If Sophia wants to go to college, the money will be there, but it will be administered by you, not by her parents. That's brilliant. It protects Sophia's interests while preventing Jessica and Richard from using her education as leverage for more money. By noon, all the paperwork was complete. The trust revocation would be official within 24 hours, and Jessica's final $5,000 payment would be her last. Maggie, you should know that Jessica will probably contact you once she realizes what's happened. She may try to negotiate, apologize, or even threaten legal action. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared for anything, Margaret. For the first time in years, I'm making decisions based on what's right for me, not what's convenient for other people. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Hello, Jessica. Mom, thank God you're answering. I'm so sorry about yesterday. Richard and I had a long talk, and we realized how insensitive we were about timing that conversation while you're still recovering. I noted that she was apologizing. For the timing, not for attempting to manipulate me while I was vulnerable. Jessica, where are you? We're at the airport in Phoenix. Our flight back to Los Angeles was delayed, so I thought I'd call and see how you're feeling. You've been at the airport this entire time? Well, no. We got a hotel room last night after leaving the hospital. I thought it would be better to give you some space to rest. A hotel room. She'd been 20 minutes away in a hotel room while I spent the night alone in the hospital, wondering if my daughter cared whether I lived or died. Jessica, I'm being discharged this afternoon. That's wonderful. Mom, listen. I was thinking that maybe you should come stay with us in Los Angeles for a few weeks while you recover. Richard and I talked about it, and we think it would be good for you to have family support during this time. I almost laughed out loud. 24 hours after abandoning me in a hospital bed, Jessica was now inviting me to come be a house guest, undoubtedly so she could continue pressuring me about financial decisions while I was recovering in her home, away from my own support system. That's very thoughtful, Jessica, but I'll be fine recovering at home. Mom, are you sure? Richard's concerned that you might be too isolated in that retirement community. What if you have another stroke? What if you fall and can't get help? Richard was concerned. The same Richard who had sent me a text message about misunderstandings while I was lying alone in a hospital bed. Jessica, I appreciate your concern, but I've made arrangements for my recovery. What kind of arrangements? That's my business to handle. There was a pause. Mom, you sound different. Are you angry with me about something? I'm not angry, Jessica. I'm clear. Clear about what? Clear about our relationship. Clear about your priorities. Clear about my own decisions. Mom, I don't understand what you're saying. Jessica, yesterday you attempted to manipulate my medical emergency to gain control of my finances. When I refused, you abandoned me in a hospital bed. Those actions have shown me exactly where I stand in your life. Mom, that's not fair. I was trying to help you plan for your future. You were trying to help yourself gain access to my money. That's not true, Jessica's voice rose. Everything I suggested was for your protection. Jessica, if you were genuinely concerned about my protection, you would have stayed at the hospital to make sure I was okay. You would have helped me arrange home care or transportation. You would have focused on my medical needs, not my financial assets. Mom, you're being unreasonable. I can't believe you're holding one conversation against me when I've been nothing but loving and supportive. Loving and supportive? I looked around my empty hospital room. Jessica, you've been taking $5,000 a month from me for 8 months while avoiding visits, deflecting phone calls, and keeping me away from my granddaughter. When I had a stroke, you saw it as an opportunity to get more money, not as a medical emergency requiring family support. That's not how it happened. That's exactly how it happened. And Jessica, it's the last time it will happen. What do you mean? I mean, I've revoked the trust fund. As of tomorrow, your monthly payments will stop. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was cold and calculated. Mom, you can't make major financial decisions while you're recovering from a stroke. It's not legally valid. Actually, it is legally valid. I've been evaluated by my physician and deemed fully competent to manage my affairs. The revocation has been properly documented and witnessed. You can't do this to us. Mom, we depend on that money. Jessica, you're 46 years old. Your husband is 47. It's time you learn to depend on yourselves. Mom, what about Sophia? You're punishing your granddaughter because you're angry with me. And there it was, using Sophia as emotional leverage, just as I'd expected. Jessica, I've established a separate education fund for Sophia that you and Richard cannot access. If she wants to go to college, the money will be there, but it will be administered by my attorney, not by you. You can't cut us out of decisions about our own daughter's education. I'm not cutting you out of anything. I'm ensuring that Sophia's educational opportunities aren't dependent on your financial choices. Mom, please reconsider this. We're family. We can work through whatever problems you think we have. Jessica, we had the opportunity to work through our problems yesterday when I was lying in a hospital bed. You chose to leave instead. I was giving you time to think. No, you were waiting for me to cave to your demands. When it became clear that I wouldn't, you left. Mom, if you do this, it's going to damage our relationship permanently. Jessica, our relationship was damaged permanently when you abandoned me in a hospital bed. I'm just acknowledging that reality. I can't believe you're choosing money over family. The irony was breathtaking. Jessica, I'm not choosing money over family. You already made that choice when you walked out of my hospital room because I wouldn't give you control of my finances. Mom, please, let's sit down and talk about this rationally when you're feeling better. I am feeling better. Better than I've felt in months, actually. For the first time in years, I'm making decisions based on what's right for me instead of what's convenient for other people. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, don't expect us to pretend everything is normal between us. Jessica, everything hasn't been normal between us for a long time. I was just too generous to admit it. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my hospital bed, staring at my phone, waiting for the guilt and sadness to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Relief that I no longer had to pretend that Jessica's monthly calls were genuine expressions of love rather than financial check-ins. Relief that I no longer had to wonder why I was being excluded from family gatherings and holidays. Relief that I no longer had to enable a lifestyle of entitlement. And irresponsibility. Most importantly, relief that I had finally stopped allowing other people to exploit my love for them. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with text messages from Richard. "Maggie, Jessica is very upset. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We need to talk about this face-to-face. Can we come to your house this weekend? Maggie, please reconsider. We're family, and families should support each other. This decision will hurt Sophia more than anyone else. I hope you realize that cutting off financial support could damage Jessica's relationship with you permanently. We've always been grateful for your generosity. Please don't let one difficult conversation destroy our family." I read each message and deleted it without responding. Richard was pulling out every manipulation tactic in the book. Guilt, family, obligation, threats, false urgency. But I was done being manipulated. That afternoon, Dr. Williams discharged me with instructions for follow-up care and physical therapy. Margaret had arranged for a medical transport service to take me home, along with a home health aide who would stay with me for the first few days. As the transport van pulled away from St. Mary's Medical Center, I looked back at the building, where I'd discovered my daughter's true nature and made the most important decision of my adult life. I was going home not as the abandoned, vulnerable woman who had been brought there 3 days ago, but as someone who had finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. My phone buzzed with another text from Richard. "Maggie, we're boarding our flight back to LA. Please think about Sophia and what's best for the whole family." I turned off my phone and settled back in my seat. For the first time in months, I was thinking about what was best for me, and that felt absolutely wonderful. The first week back in my apartment at Desert Sunrise Senior Community was both peaceful and eye-opening. Without the constant worry about Jessica's monthly financial needs or the guilt of not being available enough for her family, I found myself sleeping better than I had in months. The home health aide, Maria Santos, was a godsend, not just for her medical expertise, but for her refreshingly honest perspective on family relationships. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said on my third day home, as she helped me organize my medications, "you seem much more relaxed than most of my patients who've just had strokes. Usually, people are anxious about their recovery, worried about independence. You seem peaceful." "I feel peaceful," I admitted. "It's strange, but making some difficult decisions about toxic relationships has actually helped my recovery." Maria nodded knowingly. "I see this a lot in my work. Sometimes the most stressful thing in elderly people's lives isn't their health. It's family members who create drama and make demands. When patients finally set boundaries, their blood pressure improves, they sleep better, everything gets better." Have you seen situations like mine before? More than you'd think. Adult children who see their parents as ATM machines instead of people. They usually disappear when the money stops flowing, which tells you everything you need to know about their motivations. Maria's matter-of-fact assessment was both validating and sobering. I wasn't the first elderly person to discover that family members had been exploiting them financially. On Thursday of that first week, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. It was from a law firm in Beverly Hills, Thornfield, Watson and Associates, representing Jessica and Richard in a legal challenge to my trust revocation. The letter was formal and intimidating, full of legal jargon about diminished capacity, undue influence, and protective proceedings. But the basic message was clear. Jessica and Richard were claiming that my decision to revoke the trust was invalid because I was mentally incompetent due to my stroke. I immediately called Margaret Chen, I was expecting this, Margaret said after I read her the letter. Maggie, don't be alarmed. This is a standard intimidation tactic. They're hoping you'll be scared enough to reinstate the trust rather than fight a legal battle. Can they win? Not. With the documentation we have. Remember, we videotaped your competency evaluation. We have Dr. Williams' medical clearance, and we documented your decision-making process thoroughly. Plus, their own behavior, abandoning you in the hospital, actually supports your case. What do I need to do? Nothing right now except forward me all communications from their attorneys. I'll handle the response. But Maggie, I think you should know that this kind of legal challenge is expensive. They're either very confident in their case, or they're desperate enough to spend money they don't have. What do you mean? Think about it. They just lost $5,000 in monthly income. Yet they're hiring Beverly Hills attorneys to fight the trust revocation. Where is that money coming from? Margaret's question bothered me for the rest of the day. If Jessica and Richard were truly in the financial crisis they'd described, how were they funding legal fees that could easily run into the tens of thousands of dollars? That evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. If Jessica and Richard were going to challenge my mental competency in court, I wanted to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I started with social media. Jessica's Instagram account, which had always been public, painted a very different picture than the one she'd presented to me over the past year. Instead of a struggling family barely making ends meet, I saw photos of expensive dinners, designer clothing, and luxury experiences that seemed completely inconsistent with their claimed financial distress. More troubling were the dates on the photos. Pictures of Jessica at a 300 per person wine tasting in Napa Valley were posted just 2 weeks after her tearful phone call about losing the house. Photos of Richard's new golf clubs, which looked like they cost several $1,000s, were taken a month after he'd supposedly lost his latest business venture. But what really caught my attention was a photo Jessica had posted just 3 days after leaving me in the hospital. It showed her and Richard at what appeared to be an expensive spa resort, with the caption, "Sometimes you need to step away from family drama and focus on self-care. Grateful for this peaceful retreat. Our boundaries, our self-care, ours are grateful, family drama." She was referring to abandoning her 70-year-old mother in a hospital bed as family drama. I screenshot every photo and saved them to a folder on my computer. Then I decided to dig deeper. Frank had taught me years ago that public records could reveal a lot about people's financial situations. Property records, business filings, court documents. Much of it was available online if you knew where to look. What I discovered about Richard's business ventures was shocking. His sustainable fashion line that supposedly needed investor funding, according to California business records, it had never been formally incorporated. The boutique fitness studio that had failed. It had actually been successful and profitable until Richard sold it abruptly and moved the money into a personal investment account. Most damning of all, I found records showing that Richard had filed for bankruptcy protection twice in the past 10 years, something Jessica had never mentioned to me. Both bankruptcies had been dismissed when Richard suddenly came into money that allowed him to pay off creditors. I was beginning to understand a pattern. Richard would start legitimate businesses, run them into debt through poor management or personal spending, then sell or abandon them when creditors came calling. The mysterious infusions of money that saved him from bankruptcy consequences likely came from family members. First his parents, then me. But the discovery that truly sickened me came when I searched for Jessica's name in the California court system. 3 months ago, just a month before her desperate phone call to me about needing $200,000, Jessica had been sued by a former friend named Amanda Chen for $75,000. According to the court filings, Jessica had convinced Amanda to invest in one of Richard's business ventures with the promise of guaranteed returns. When the business failed and Amanda lost her money, she sued Jessica for fraud and misrepresentation. The case was still pending. I stared at my computer screen, trying to process what I was reading. Jessica hadn't just been enabling Richard's financial irresponsibility. She had been actively participating in it. She had convinced a friend to invest money in schemes she must have known were risky, then failed to take responsibility when that friend lost everything. This wasn't about a family struggling with temporary financial hardship. This was about a pattern of financial fraud and manipulation that extended far beyond their relationship with me. My phone rang, interrupting my research. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a Los Angeles area code. Hello? Mrs. Sullivan. This is Amanda Chen. I got your number from the court records in my lawsuit against your daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I felt like you had a right to know what kind of person you're dealing with. My heart started racing. Ms. Chen, what can I tell you? Mrs. Sullivan, I was Jessica's friend for over 5 years. We met through a book club and became close. Last year, she approached me about investing in Richard's cryptocurrency trading platform. She showed me projections, profit statements, testimonials from other investors. She convinced me that it was a sure thing. What happened? I invested $75,000, my entire inheritance from my grandmother. Within 3 months, Richard had lost all of it through what he called market volatility. When I asked for documentation about where the money had gone, Jessica became defensive and stopped returning my calls. Ms. Chen, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Mrs. Sullivan, that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because when I filed my lawsuit, I hired a private investigator to look into Richard's business practices. What we found was extensive. What do you mean? Richard and Jessica have been running investment scams for at least 3 years. They target people with substantial savings, retirees, inheritance recipients, successful professionals who trust Jessica because of her law background. They present fake business opportunities, collect money from investors, then claim the ventures. Failed due to market forces. I felt sick to my stomach. How many people have they victimized? We identified at least 12, possibly more. The total amount stolen appears to be over $800,000. $800,000. Almost exactly the amount of the trust fund I had established for Jessica. Ms. Chen, why are you telling me this? Because my investigator found records suggesting that your trust fund payments have been used to pay back some of the other victims when they threaten legal action. Mrs. Sullivan, I think your daughter and son-in-law have been using your money to cover up their crimes. I sank into my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Amanda was telling me. Do you have documentation of this? Extensive documentation. Mrs. Sullivan, I know this is difficult to hear about your own daughter, but I think you should know that Jessica and Richard are planning to use the trust fund as evidence in their legal case against you. What do you mean? They're going to argue that your decision to revoke the trust was irrational because it will prevent them from paying back the people they've defrauded. They're going to claim that you're interfering with their attempts to make restitution, which proves you're not thinking clearly. The audacity was breathtaking. They were going to use their own criminal behavior as evidence that I was mentally incompetent. Ms. Chen, would you be willing to share your documentation with my attorney? Absolutely. Mrs. Sullivan, there's something else you should know. My investigator discovered that Jessica and Richard have been planning this legal challenge to your trust for months. They consulted with attorneys about conservatorship proceedings before you even had your stroke. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. They were planning to have me declared incompetent? According to the emails my investigator obtained, they were researching ways to gain control of your assets due to your advancing age and declining judgment. Your stroke just gave them a convenient excuse to move forward with plans they'd already made. After Amanda hung up, I sat in my living room staring out at the Arizona desert, trying to process everything I'd learned. My daughter hadn't just been financially irresponsible or manipulative, she had been actively criminal. And she had been planning to steal my entire estate even before I had my medical emergency. The trust fund I'd established to help my family had actually been funding a criminal enterprise. The monthly payments I'd thought were helping Jessica and Richard pay their bills had actually been used to cover up fraud and prevent their victims from pursuing legal action. Most devastating of all, my generosity had enabled Jessica and Richard to hurt other people. Amanda Chen's grandmother's inheritance was gone because I had provided Jessica with the credibility and financial backing that made her seem like a trustworthy investment partner. I called Margaret immediately and told her everything Amanda had shared with me. Jesus Christ, Maggie, this changes everything. If we can prove that the trust fund payments were used to cover up criminal activity, Jessica and Richard's legal challenge becomes frivolous. No court is going to force you to fund criminal enterprises. Margaret, I feel sick thinking about all the people who were hurt because I trusted my daughter. Maggie, you are not responsible for Jessica's criminal choices. You established that trust fund with the best of intentions, based on information you believed to be true. The fact that Jessica misused your generosity doesn't make you culpable for her crimes. What happens now? Now we go on the offensive. I'm going to contact Amanda Chen's attorney and get copies of all their documentation. We're going to compile evidence of Jessica and Richard's criminal behavior and file a counter motion asking the court to investigate them for elder abuse and fraud. Will that stop their legal challenge? It'll do more than that. If we can prove they've been using your trust fund payments to cover up crimes, they could face serious criminal charges. And Maggie, any judge who sees evidence that they planned to challenge your competency before your stroke will throw their case out immediately. That evening, I made a decision that felt both scary and liberating. I called Amanda Chen back and asked if she would introduce me to some of the other victims of Jessica and Richard's schemes. Mrs. Sullivan, are you sure you want to do that? It might be very upsetting to hear how your money was used. Ms. Chen, these people deserve to know that someone in Jessica's family cares about what happened to them. And frankly, I need to understand the full scope of what I've been unknowingly funding. Over the next 3 days, Amanda introduced me to 7 other victims of Jessica and Richard's investment fraud. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. Trusted friends or acquaintances who had been convinced to invest in can't-miss business opportunities, only to lose their life savings when the ventures mysteriously failed. Patricia Williams, a 68-year-old retired teacher, had lost $45,000 from her pension fund. Jessica seemed so knowledgeable about legal issues, Patricia told me during our phone conversation. She showed me contracts and business plans that looked completely legitimate. I trusted her because she seemed like such a devoted daughter and mother. Michael Torres, a 55-year-old engineer, had invested $60,000 in Richard's revolutionary food delivery app. The projections they showed me indicated I'd double my money within 6 months, he said. When I started asking questions about why the app wasn't available in any app stores, Jessica told me I was being impatient and that successful investments take time. Each conversation was more devastating than the last. These weren't naive or gullible people. They were intelligent, successful individuals who had trusted Jessica and Richard because they seemed credible and professional. And they had seemed credible and professional because my trust fund payments had allowed them to maintain an expensive lifestyle that suggested financial success and stability. Mrs. Sullivan, Patricia Williams said during our second conversation, I want you to know that I don't blame you for what your daughter did, but I do want you to understand how your support enabled her to hurt other people. Patricia, I take full responsibility for that. I should have done more due diligence before establishing the trust fund. Mrs. Sullivan, there's something else. My attorney discovered that some of the money Jessica returned to victims when they threatened legal action came directly from bank accounts that received your trust fund payments. You were essentially funding the cover-up of their crimes. I felt sick thinking about it, but I also felt something else. Determination. If my money had been used to enable criminal behavior, then I had a responsibility to help the victims seek justice. Patricia, would you and the other victims be willing to work with my attorney to build a case against Jessica and Richard? Mrs. Sullivan, we've been waiting for someone with the resources and motivation to take them on. Most of us can't afford extended legal battles, and Jessica and Richard have been counting on that. Well, they miscalculated. I may be 70 years old, but I'm not going down without a fight. After hanging up with Patricia, I called Margaret and told her about my conversations with the fraud victims. Maggie, this is exactly what we need to destroy. Their legal challenge. If we can show that they've been using your trust fund to cover up systematic fraud, no judge will take their competency claim seriously. Margaret, I want to do more than just defend against their lawsuit. I want to help these victims get their money back. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Jessica and Richard have lived off stolen money for years. They have assets. The house they're renting, cars, jewelry, expensive possessions. If we can force them into bankruptcy and asset forfeiture, we might be able to recover some of the stolen funds. Maggie, that's a noble goal, but it could be expensive and time-consuming. Margaret, I have the resources, and frankly, I have the motivation. These people were hurt because my daughter used my financial support to seem credible and trustworthy. I owe it to them to help make things right. That night, I made a list of everything I knew about Jessica and Richard's assets and financial situation. The Beverly Hills house, Richard's car collection, Jessica's jewelry and designer clothing, the expensive furnishings I'd seen during my visits. If those assets had been purchased with money stolen from fraud victims, then they could potentially be seized and liquidated to provide restitution. But more importantly, forcing Jessica and Richard to face the full legal consequences of their actions would send a clear message that targeting elderly people for financial exploitation comes with serious risks, was no longer just defending myself against their legal challenge. I was going on the offensive to protect other potential victims and seek justice for the people they'd already hurt. And I was just getting started. 3 weeks after discovering the true scope of Jessica and Richard's criminal enterprise, I stood in Margaret Chen's law office surrounded by boxes of evidence that would destroy my daughter's life as she knew it. Bank records, business documents, victim testimonials, social media screenshots, and financial forensic reports filled the conference table like the pieces of a complex puzzle that finally revealed its devastating picture. Maggie, Margaret said, reviewing the final documentation. This is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse and fraud cases I've ever assembled. We have enough evidence to not only defeat their competency challenge, but to pursue criminal charges and civil asset forfeiture. I looked at the mountain of evidence documenting Jessica and Richard's 3-year crime spree. Evidence that showed how my trust fund had unknowingly bankrolled a sophisticated fraud operation that had destroyed the financial security of over a dozen victims. What's our next step? We have several options. We can file a motion to dismiss their competency challenge based on the evidence of their criminal behavior. We can refer the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. We can file civil suits on behalf of the victims for asset recovery. Or we can do all three simultaneously. I thought about Patricia Williams, the retired teacher who had lost her entire pension fund. About Michael Torres, whose inheritance from his father had vanished into Richard's fake cryptocurrency scheme. About Amanda Chen, whose grandmother's legacy had been stolen to fund Jessica and Richard's Beverly Hills lifestyle. We do all three, I said. These people deserve justice, and other potential victims deserve protection. Margaret nodded approvingly. I was hoping you'd say that. Maggie, you should know that once we file these motions, there's no going back. Jessica and Richard will likely face serious prison time if they're convicted. Margaret, I spent 46 years raising Jessica to understand the difference between right and wrong. If she chose to use those lessons to become a more effective criminal, that's not my failure. It's hers. The first domino fell 2 days later when Margaret filed our counter-motion in response to Jessica and Richard's competency challenge. Our top filing included a detailed timeline of their criminal activities. documentation of how my trust fund payments had been used to cover up fraud, and evidence that they had planned to challenge my mental capacity months before my stroke even occurred. But we didn't stop there. Margaret simultaneously filed a referral to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office requesting criminal investigation of Jessica and Richard for elder abuse, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The referral included sworn statements from 8 fraud victims and financial forensic analysis showing exactly how my trust fund money had been used to pay off threatening creditors and maintain the lifestyle that made their scams credible. The response was immediate and devastating. Within 24 hours, the Beverly Hills law firm representing Jessica and Richard withdrew from the case without explanation. Professional ethics rules likely prevented them from continuing to represent clients they now knew were using the legal system to cover up criminal activity. Within 48 hours, Jessica called me in tears. "Mom, what have you done? The police just served us with search warrants and froze all our bank accounts. They've seized Richard's cars and they're talking about seizing the house." I felt a moment of sadness hearing my daughter's panic. But I remembered Patricia Williams crying as she told me about losing her life savings to Jessica's lies. "Jessica, I provided law enforcement with evidence of your criminal activities. What happens next depends on your choices." Criminal activities? Mom? Those were business investments that didn't work out. That's not criminal. Jessica, you solicited money from investors using false projections and fraudulent business plans. When the ventures failed, you used my trust fund payments to selectively pay back victims who threatened legal action, while leaving others with nothing. That's not failed business ventures, that's systematic fraud. Mom, you don't understand how business works. Sometimes investments fail. That doesn't make it fraud. Jessica, your cryptocurrency trading platform never actually traded cryptocurrency. Your sustainable fashion line was never incorporated as a business. Your boutique fitness studio was profitable until Richard sold it and kept the money, instead of paying investors. These weren't failed businesses. They were elaborate lies designed to steal money from people who trusted you. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Mom, even if some of the business ventures weren't entirely legitimate, that doesn't justify destroying your own daughter's life. I'm facing 20 years in prison. Jessica, you're facing 20 years in prison because you spent 3 years stealing money from elderly people and vulnerable friends. The fact that I discovered your crimes doesn't make me responsible for the consequences. What about Sophia? Mom, think about what this will do to your granddaughter. Do you really want her to grow up with parents in prison? I had been dreading this conversation, the attempt to use Sophia as emotional leverage one final time. Jessica, I've been thinking about Sophia constantly. That's why I've hired a family law attorney to petition for emergency custody. What? Sophia is 16 years old. She's spent her entire life watching her parents live beyond their means through lies and manipulation. If you and Richard go to prison, she needs stability and positive role models, not the chaos of whatever extended family members might take her in. Mom, you can't take my daughter away from me. Jessica, you and Richard are about to be arrested for multiple felonies. Sophia needs someone who can provide stability, help her finish high school, and support her college dreams without funding those goals through criminal activity. This is insane. Mom, you're destroying 3 generations of our family over money. Jessica, I'm protecting Sophia from learning that crime and manipulation are acceptable ways to solve financial problems. You and Richard taught her that families exploit each other when they need money. I'm going to teach her that families protect and support each other through honest work and mutual respect. Jessica hung up without another word. 3 days later, the news broke nationally. Beverly Hills couple arrested in multi-million-dollar investment fraud targeting elderly victims, read the headline in the Los Angeles Times. The article detailed how Jessica and Richard had used their wealthy lifestyle and social connections to target victims with elaborate Ponzi schemes and fake business investments. Most devastating for Jessica was the detail about how her own mother had provided the evidence that led to their arrest. Margaret Sullivan, 70, of Scottsdale, Arizona, discovered that her daughter and son-in-law had been using trust fund payments to cover up their criminal activities, the article reported. Mrs. Sullivan worked with fraud victims and law enforcement to build the case that led to yesterday's arrests. My phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews, but I declined them all. This wasn't about public attention or vindication. It was about justice for the victims and protection for future targets. The call I did take was from Detective Rodriguez of the LAPD Financial Crimes Unit. Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to update you on the investigation. Jessica and Richard have been charged with 19 felony counts, including elder abuse, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Based on the evidence you provided, we've been able to identify additional victims and trace the flow of stolen money through multiple bank accounts. How many victims total? 23 that we've confirmed, with losses totaling approximately $1.8 million. Mrs. Sullivan, your trust fund payments were used to pay back approximately $400,000 to victims who threatened immediate legal action, which allowed Jessica and Richard to continue their scheme for an additional 2 years. I felt sick thinking about how my generosity had enabled such extensive harm. But Detective Rodriguez continued with better news. However, because of your cooperation and the civil asset forfeiture we've initiated, we expect to recover approximately 60% of the stolen funds. The house they were renting, the cars, jewelry, and other luxury goods will be sold, and the proceeds will be distributed to victims. What about Sophia? We understand you've filed for emergency custody. Given the circumstances, and your obvious concern for her welfare, I think that petition will be successful. The child needs stability while her parents face legal proceedings that could last years. 1 week later, I sat in a family court hearing that would determine Sophia's future. My 16-year-old granddaughter looked small and scared as the judge reviewed the evidence of her parents' criminal activities and my petition for custody. Your Honor, my family law attorney explained, Mrs. Sullivan is Sophia's biological grandmother, has significant financial resources to support her education and welfare, and has already established college funds that cannot be accessed for any other purpose. Given that both parents are facing significant prison sentences, Mrs. Sullivan represents the most stable option for Sophia's remaining 2 years of high school. Jessica and Richard appeared via video link from jail, unable to make bail due to the flight risk posed by their history of financial fraud. Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice breaking, my mother is doing this to punish me, not to help Sophia. She's using my daughter as a weapon in our family conflict. The judge looked unimpressed. Ms. Blackwood, the evidence shows that you and your husband have been engaged in systematic fraud for 3 years, using your mother's financial support to maintain credibility while stealing from victims. Your mother's concern for Sophia's welfare appears to be the only stable factor in this situation. 2 hours later, I walked out of the courthouse with temporary custody of my granddaughter. The car ride back to Arizona was quiet. Sophia stared out the window, processing the complete collapse of everything she'd thought she knew about her family. Grandma Maggie, she finally said, did Mom and Dad really steal money from all those people? Yes, sweetheart, they did. Why? I think they got used to living beyond their means and convinced themselves that taking money from other people was acceptable if they intended to pay it back eventually. But they never paid it back. No, they didn't. When people started demanding their money, your parents used my trust fund payments to selectively pay back the victims who seemed most likely to cause legal problems. That allowed them to continue the fraud for longer. Sophia was quiet for several miles. Grandma, is it my fault? Should I have known something was wrong? I pulled into a rest stop and turned to face my granddaughter directly. Sophia, listen to me very carefully. You are not responsible for your parents' choices. You were a child living in their house, trusting them to be honest with you. The fact That they weren't honest doesn't make you guilty of anything. But I lived in that house. I went to expensive schools. I wore designer clothes. Was all of that bought with stolen money? Some of it probably was. But Sophia, you didn't know that, and you didn't choose it. Your parents made decisions that put you in an impossible situation. What happens now? Now you finish high school, go to college, and build a life based on honesty and hard work instead of manipulation and fraud. Will I ever see Mom and Dad again? That depends on a lot of factors: their legal situation, their willingness to take responsibility for what they've done, and your own feelings about maintaining a relationship with them. But Sophia, any future relationship you have with your parents has to be based on them earning your trust, not on you being obligated to forgive them because they're family. 6 months later, Jessica and Richard both pled guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for reduced sentences. Jessica received 12 years in federal prison. Richard received 15 years due to his role as the primary architect of the schemes. The civil asset forfeiture resulted in $1.1 million being recovered from their seized assets and distributed to victims. Patricia Williams got back 80% of her stolen pension funds. Michael Torres recovered about 70% of his father's inheritance. Amanda Chen received full restitution for her grandmother's money. Not everyone was made whole, but the recovery was better than anyone had expected. As for the competency challenge that had started this entire legal battle, it was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Jessica and Richard could never again challenge my mental capacity based on the same claims. The judge's written opinion was scathing. The evidence shows that defendants planned to challenge plaintiff's competency months before her medical event, and that their legal action was motivated by their desire to gain access to funds they needed to cover up criminal activities. This court finds that defendants' legal challenge was frivolous and undertaken in bad faith. 1 year after my stroke, I was living in a beautiful house in Scottsdale with Sophia, who was thriving as a high school senior. She had been accepted to Stanford University with a partial academic scholarship. Her college fund would cover the remainder without any financial strain. More importantly, Sophia was learning what healthy family relationships looked like. She had started therapy to process her parents' betrayal and was developing a strong sense of personal ethics and financial responsibility. "Grandma Maggie," she said one evening as we worked together in the garden, "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college. What are you considering?" "Criminal justice, with a focus on financial crimes. I want to help other families who've been hurt by fraud and elder abuse." I smiled, thinking about how Frank would have been proud to see his granddaughter choosing a career dedicated to protecting vulnerable people instead of exploiting them. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." 2 years later, I received a letter from Jessica in federal prison. She had completed various rehabilitation programs and wanted to apologize for her actions and attempt to rebuild our relationship. I read the letter carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus strategic manipulation. The language was different from her previous communications, less focused on her own suffering and more focused on acknowledging the harm she had caused. "I understand now that what Richard and I did wasn't just illegal. It was morally wrong," she wrote. "We hurt people who trusted us, and we used your love and generosity to enable that harm. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I take full responsibility for my choices." I showed the letter to Sophia, who was home for winter break from Stanford. "What do you think?" I asked. Sophia, now 18 and wise beyond her years, considered carefully. "I think she's probably being sincere, but I also think it's too early to know if she's truly changed or if she's just learned to say the right things. Maybe we could start with occasional letters and see if her actions match her words over time." "That sounds very mature. Grandma, you taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or trusting blindly. It means being open to the possibility of rebuilding relationships if the other person demonstrates consistent change over time. I hugged my granddaughter, marveling at how much wisdom she'd gained from experiencing the worst and best of human nature before her 19th birthday. That evening, I wrote back to Jessica, a brief, polite response that acknowledged her letter and left the door open for future communication if she continued to demonstrate genuine change. But I also did something else. I took out a sheet of paper and wrote a letter to myself, a letter I planned to read whenever I felt tempted to ignore red flags or enable harmful behavior in the name of family loyalty. Dear Maggie, remember that love without boundaries is not love, it's enabling. Remember that family members who only contact you when they need money are not family, they're customers. Remember that people who abandon you during medical emergencies and try to steal your life savings have shown you exactly who they are. Believe them. Most importantly, remember that you are worthy of respect, honesty, and genuine affection. You do not have to earn love by giving away your financial security, and you do not have to accept manipulation in the name of family harmony. You are 73 years old, and you deserve to live the rest of your life surrounded by people who love you, for who you are, not for what you can do for them. Love, the woman who finally learned to choose herself. 3 years after my stroke, I was featured in a national news segment about elder abuse prevention. The interviewer asked me what advice I would give to other elderly people who suspect they're being financially exploited by family members. Trust your instincts, I said. If someone only contacts you when they need money, if they make you feel guilty for having boundaries, if they try to isolate you from other support systems, those are red flags. Love doesn't come with financial obligations, and healthy families don't use emotional manipulation to control each other. What about people who worry about damaging family relationships by setting boundaries? I would ask them this: what kind of relationship are you actually protecting? If your family members disappear when the money stops flowing, were they ever really your family, or were they just people who happen to share your DNA? Any final thoughts for our viewers? Yes, it's never too late to choose yourself. I was 70 years old when I finally learned that I deserved better than being treated as a source of funding rather than a person worthy of love and respect. Age doesn't disqualify you from demanding dignity. As I walked off the set that day, I thought about the journey that had brought me from being abandoned in a hospital bed to becoming an advocate for elder abuse prevention. I thought about the victims who had gotten their money back, about Sophia thriving at Stanford, about the peace I felt living in a home free from manipulation and financial exploitation. Jessica had thought she was destroying my life when she walked out of that hospital room because I refused to give her control of my money. Instead, she had set me free to build the life I deserved, a life based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation, surrounded by people who valued me as a person rather than as a source of funding. The best revenge, I had learned, wasn't revenge at all. The best revenge was living well, on your own terms, with people who actually loved you. And at 73 years old, I was finally doing exactly that. Today, 5 years after my stroke, I volunteer with the Arizona Coalition Against Elder Abuse, helping other elderly people recognize and escape financial exploitation. Sophia graduated from Stanford with honors and is now in law school, specializing in elder law and victims' rights. Jessica was released from federal prison last year after serving 8 years of her sentence. She moved to a different state and has not attempted to contact Sophia or me. I hope she has truly changed and is building an honest life, but I no longer feel obligated to enable or rescue her. Richard is still incarcerated and will be for several more years. As for me, I'm living in a beautiful retirement community, surrounded by genuine friends, traveling when I want to, and supporting causes I care about. My money is protected by legal structures that ensure it will be used according to my wishes, not manipulated, by people who see me as an opportunity. Most importantly, I wake up every morning knowing that everyone in my life has chosen to be there because they value my company, not because they need my financial support. It took me 70 years to learn that lesson, but it was worth the wait. 5 years after my stroke changed everything, I stood before a packed auditorium at the Arizona State Capitol, delivering the keynote address for Elder Abuse Prevention Awareness Month. The audience included legislators, law enforcement officials, social workers, and dozens of elderly people who had survived financial exploitation by their own family members. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," I began, "and 5 years ago I was abandoned in a hospital bed by my daughter because I refused to give her control of my life savings. Today, I want to tell you how that betrayal became the catalyst for the most empowering period of my life." As I looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, some bearing the unmistakable look of people who had survived similar betrayals, I thought about the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman standing at this podium was not the same woman who had been wheeled into St. Mary's Medical Center 5 years ago. That woman had been generous to a fault, eager to please, and willing to sacrifice her own well-being to maintain family harmony. The woman speaking today was strong, clear-eyed, and committed to helping others avoid the same painful lessons she had learned. But the transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. The first year after Jessica and Richard's convictions had been particularly challenging. Despite the legal victory and the satisfaction of seeing justice served, I struggled with profound grief over the loss of the daughter I thought I knew. It wasn't just that Jessica had turned out to be a criminal, it was that the loving, ambitious, principled young woman I had raised seemed to have been an illusion all along. How do you mourn someone who isn't dead, but who never really existed in the first place? I had asked Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist who had helped me process the complex emotions surrounding Jessica's betrayal. "You're grieving the relationship you thought you had and the daughter you believed you raised," Dr. Martinez had explained. "That grief is real and valid, even though Jessica is still alive. In many ways, the person you loved did die. She just died slowly, over many years, as she made choices that fundamentally changed who she was." The therapy sessions had been crucial in helping me understand that my love for Jessica hadn't been wasted, even though she had exploited it. The values I had tried to instill in her, honesty, compassion, responsibility, weren't meaningless just because she had chosen to reject them. And most importantly, I learned that I couldn't take responsibility for her adult choices no matter how much those choices hurt other people. But while I was processing my grief over Jessica, something beautiful was happening with Sophia. My granddaughter had not only survived the trauma of discovering her parents' criminal behavior, she had used it as motivation to become an extraordinary young woman. During her senior year of high school, Sophia had founded a peer support group for teenagers whose parents were incarcerated. She had volunteered with victim advocacy organizations and had written her college application essay about learning to define family by choice rather than by blood. "Grandma Maggie," she had said one evening as we prepared dinner together, "I used to be embarrassed about what my parents did. But now I realize that their choices don't define me. My response to their choices defines me." Watching Sophia thrive had been one of the greatest gifts of this entire ordeal. At 18, she possessed a wisdom and emotional intelligence that many adults never develop. She understood the difference between enabling and helping, between loyalty and blind obedience, between love and manipulation. Stanford University had been the perfect environment for her to grow. She had excelled academically, while also becoming involved in student government and victim rights advocacy. Her professors consistently praised her maturity and her ability to analyze complex ethical issues with nuance and insight. But perhaps, most remarkably, Sophia had developed a healthy relationship with boundaries and self-advocacy that I had never learned until my 70s. "I got a letter from Mom yesterday," she had told me during one of our weekly phone calls during her sophomore year. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, I'm not ready to have a relationship with her yet. She's saying the right things in her letters, but I need to see consistent change over time before I'm willing to trust her again. And I need to be in a stronger emotional place myself before I can handle the complexity of that relationship." I had been so proud of her thoughtful approach. At 19, Sophia was making decisions about family relationships that had taken me 7 decades to learn how to make. Meanwhile, my own transformation was accelerating in ways I never could have imagined. The success of our case against Jessica and Richard had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across the country. I began receiving calls from prosecutors and investigators working on similar elder abuse cases, asking if I would be willing to share my experience with other victims. The first time I spoke to a support group for elder abuse survivors, I was terrified. What could I possibly say to people who had been through similar betrayals? What wisdom could I offer that wouldn't sound condescending or naive? But as I shared my story, the gradual isolation, the financial manipulation, the hospital abandonment, and the legal battle that followed, I saw recognition in the faces of my audience. These were people who understood the unique pain of being betrayed by family members who were supposed to love and protect them. "The hardest part," said Eleanor, a 78-year-old woman whose son had stolen her entire retirement fund, "is that everyone expects you to forgive them because they're family. People act like you're being vindictive if you don't just let it go." "I know exactly what you mean," I replied. "I was told repeatedly that I was choosing money over family. But what people don't understand is that Jessica and Richard had already chosen money over family when they decided to exploit and abandon me. I was just refusing to enable that choice anymore." That first support group meeting led to another, then another. Within 6 months, I was speaking regularly to groups across Arizona, sharing my story and helping other elderly people recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. The work was emotionally demanding but incredibly fulfilling. Every time I helped someone understand that they weren't obligated to fund their adult children's lifestyle, every time I encouraged someone to set boundaries with manipulative relatives, I felt like I was honoring Frank's memory and the values he had tried to instill in our family. But the real breakthrough came when I partnered with the Arizona Attorney General's office to develop a comprehensive elder abuse prevention program. "Mrs. Sullivan," said Attorney General Patricia Morrison, during our first meeting, "your case has become a model for how to prosecute complex family fraud schemes. We'd like you to help us train law enforcement officers and social workers to recognize the patterns you identified." The training program we developed was unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of focusing solely on legal procedures and investigative techniques, we emphasized the psychological and emotional aspects of family financial abuse. "The victims aren't just losing money," I would tell law enforcement audiences. "They're losing their faith in family, their sense of security, and often their willingness to trust anyone ever again. Understanding that emotional component is crucial to building cases that will actually hold up in court." We created detailed guides for recognizing the warning signs of elder financial abuse. Adult children who only contact elderly parents when they need money, gradual isolation from friends, other family members, or support systems pressure to make immediate financial decisions during medical crises, attempts to gain power of attorney or control over assets using fear tactics, lifestyle discrepancies between claimed financial hardship and actual spending, use of grandchildren or other loved ones as emotional leverage, but more importantly, we developed protocols for empowering elderly victims to take action. Comprehensive documentation of financial irregularities and suspicious behaviors, legal protections for assets during investigation periods, support systems for victims who face retaliation for reporting abuse, coordination between criminal prosecution and civil asset recovery, long-term counseling and advocacy services. Program was so successful that it was adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 other states within 2 years. As my advocacy work expanded, I began receiving invitations to speak at national conferences and congressional hearings on elder abuse. The shy, people-pleasing woman who had been afraid to confront her own daughter about financial manipulation was now testifying before United States senators about the need for stronger legal protections for elderly Americans. Elder financial abuse is not a family dispute, I told the Senate Judiciary Committee during a hearing on proposed legislation. It is a crime that specifically targets vulnerable populations and causes both immediate financial harm and long-term psychological trauma. We must stop treating these cases as private matters and start recognizing them as the serious crimes they are. The legislation that emerged from those hearings, the Elder Justice Protection Act, included several provisions that had been directly influenced by my case and advocacy work. Mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions that identify suspicious activity enhanced penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives, streamlined procedures for asset recovery and victim restitution, federal funding for elder abuse prevention and victim services. Seeing those legal changes enacted felt like the ultimate vindication of everything I had been through. Jessica's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also created an opportunity to protect thousands of other elderly people from similar exploitation. Meanwhile, my relationship with Sophia continued to deepen and evolve. She was now in her 3rd year at Stanford, majoring in public policy with a focus on victim rights advocacy. Her academic work was directly influenced by our family's experience, but she had found ways to channel that experience into positive change rather than bitter resentment. "Grandma," she told me during one of her visits home, "I've been thinking about doing my senior thesis on the psychological factors that make elderly people vulnerable to family financial abuse." "That sounds fascinating. What's your hypothesis?" "I think it's related to the way society teaches us that family loyalty should be unconditional. Elderly people, especially women of your generation, were raised to believe that family harmony was more important than individual well-being. That cultural programming makes it hard to recognize manipulation when it comes from family members." Sophia's insight was remarkably sophisticated. She understood that my vulnerability to Jessica's exploitation hadn't been a personal failing. It had been the result of cultural messaging that taught women to prioritize other people's comfort over their own protection. "You know what's interesting?" I told her. "I spent so many years thinking I was being a good mother by enabling Jessica's irresponsible behavior. I thought that setting boundaries would make me selfish or mean. It never occurred to me that failing to set boundaries was actually making me complicit in her destructive choices." "Exactly. You were so focused on being a loving mother that you forgot you also deserved to be loved respectfully." Jessica took advantage of that imbalance. These conversations with Sophia were among the most valuable aspects of our relationship. She helped me understand my own experience through a more analytical lens, while I provided her with real-world context for her academic studies. But perhaps more importantly, our relationship had become a model of what healthy family dynamics could look like. We supported each other without sacrificing our individual autonomy. We maintained close emotional bonds without using guilt or manipulation to control each other's choices. We shared resources generously, but with clear boundaries and mutual respect. "Grandma," Sophia said during one particularly meaningful conversation, "I want you to know that living with you these past few years has taught me what real love looks like. My parents' version of love was conditional and transactional. Your version of love is supportive and empowering." By my 4th year of advocacy work, I had spoken to thousands of elderly people about financial abuse prevention. I had helped dozens of victims navigate the legal system and recover stolen assets. I had consulted on legislation that would protect future generations of elderly Americans. But the experience that affected me most deeply was meeting Robert Chen, Amanda's father, and a fellow survivor of Jessica and Richard's fraud scheme. Robert had lost $85,000 to one of Richard's fake investment opportunities, money he had been saving for his wife's long-term care after her Alzheimer's diagnosis. Unlike some of the other victims, Robert had never gotten his money back through the asset recovery process. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said after one of my presentations, "I want to thank you for what you did. Because of your courage in exposing your daughter and son-in-law, other people were spared from being victimized by them. Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry you didn't recover your losses. I know how much that money meant to your family. Mrs. Sullivan, the money was devastating to lose. But what hurt more was the betrayal. We trusted your daughter because she seemed so caring and professional. Learning that she was using our trust to steal from us, that was harder to recover from than the financial loss." Robert's words reminded me that the victims of Jessica and Richard's crimes had suffered more than financial damage. They had lost their ability to trust, their sense of security, and their faith in human goodness. That realization inspired me to expand my advocacy work beyond legal and financial issues, to include the emotional recovery process for elder abuse survivors. Working with Dr. Martinez and other trauma specialists, I helped develop support groups specifically designed for elderly people who had been financially exploited by family members. These groups addressed the unique psychological challenges faced by elder abuse survivors. The shame and self-blame that comes from being victimized by trusted family members, the difficulty of maintaining other family relationships after reporting abuse, the outrage, fear of being targeted again by different potential exploiters, the challenge of rebuilding financial security after significant losses. "The isolation is often worse than the financial damage," explained Dorothy, a regular attendee at our support groups. "When my grandson stole my savings, I didn't just lose money. I lost my faith in family. I stopped trusting my own judgment about people's motivations." Helping Dorothy and others like her rebuild their confidence and their ability to form healthy relationships became one of the most rewarding aspects of my advocacy work. As I approached my 75th birthday, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that devastating day in the hospital. The woman who had been abandoned in a hospital bed had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights. The woman who had been too timid to confront her own daughter's manipulation was now challenging senators and prosecutors to do more, to protect vulnerable elderly Americans. But perhaps most significantly, I had learned to value myself as much as I valued others. For 7 decades, I had defined my worth through my ability to serve other people's needs. Now I understood that my own needs, boundaries, and well-being were equally important. This shift in perspective had transformed every aspect of my life. I had developed friendships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. I had learned to say no to requests that didn't align with my values or priorities. I had discovered interests and activities that brought me joy rather than just serving other people's expectations. "Grandma," Sophia said during a visit home for spring break, "you seem happier now than I ever remember you being when I was little." I think I am happier. Living authentically is much more satisfying than living to please other people. What do you mean by living authentically? I mean making choices based on my own values and needs, not on what I think other people want from me. For most of my life, I was so focused on being the person I thought I should be. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, that I forgot to figure out who I actually was. 6 months later, I received news that would test everything I had learned about forgiveness, boundaries, and authentic living. Jessica was being released from federal prison after serving 5 years of her 12-year sentence due to good behavior and completion of extensive rehabilitation programs. "Mrs. Sullivan," called her parole officer, "Jessica has requested permission to contact you as part of her reintegration planning. She's required to make amends to victims as part of her parole. Conditions. Are you willing to speak with her?" I had been dreading and anticipating this moment for years. I had processed my anger, grief, and disappointment through therapy and advocacy work. I had built a fulfilling life that didn't depend on Jessica's presence or absence, but I still didn't know how I would feel about actually seeing or speaking to my daughter again. "I need some time to think about it," I told the parole officer. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to discuss my feelings about Jessica's potential re-entry into my life. "Maggie, how do you feel about the possibility of seeing Jessica again?" "Honestly, I feel nothing. Not anger, not excitement, not dread. Just nothing." "Is that normal?" "It's completely normal. You've processed your grief about the relationship and built a life that doesn't revolve around her choices. Emotional neutrality might actually be the healthiest possible response. But what if she's genuinely changed? What if she really is sorry and wants to make amends? Then you can consider what kind of relationship, if any, you might want to have with her. But Maggie, remember that forgiveness doesn't require you to trust her again or to have her back in your life. You can forgive someone while still maintaining boundaries that protect your well-being." After a week of consideration, I decided to meet with Jessica, once in a controlled setting, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The meeting took place at Margaret Chen's law office, with Margaret present as both legal counsel and emotional support. Jessica arrived accompanied by her parole officer and a victim services advocate. The woman who walked into that conference room was not the entitled, manipulative person who had abandoned me in a hospital bed 5 years earlier. Jessica looked older, humbler, and genuinely remorseful in a way I had never seen before. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I have no right to ask for your time or attention after what I did to you and to all those other people." I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of the manipulation tactics she had used so effectively in the past. But what I saw was someone who appeared to have experienced genuine transformation. "Jessica, I agreed to this meeting because your parole officer said you wanted to make amends. What does that mean to you?" "It means acknowledging the full scope of the harm I caused and taking responsibility for my choices without making excuses or asking for anything in return." For the next hour, Jessica detailed her understanding of how her actions had affected not just me, but all the fraud victims, Sophia, and even her relationship with Richard. "I used your love for me as a weapon against you," she said. "I manipulated your medical emergency to try to steal your life savings. I abandoned you when you were vulnerable because I was more concerned about money than about your well-being. And I involved Sophia in adult conflicts that damaged her relationship with both of us. What about the other victims? I've written letters to every person Richard and I defrauded, acknowledging my role in their losses and offering what little restitution I can provide from my prison work earnings. I know it's not enough to make up for what we stole, but I wanted them to know that I understand the real impact of our crimes." "Jessica, what's different now? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation?" "You don't know, and you shouldn't trust me based on what I'm saying today. If I've truly changed, I'll prove it through consistent actions over time. And Mom, I understand if you never want to see me again. What I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect forgiveness." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes. But those last words told me everything I needed to know about Jessica's transformation. The old Jessica would have demanded forgiveness and become angry if it wasn't immediately granted. This Jessica understood that forgiveness was something that had to be earned, not demanded. As the meeting concluded, I made a decision that felt both generous and self-protective. "Jessica, I'm willing to consider rebuilding some kind of relationship with you, but it will have to be very different from what we had before." "What do you mean?" "I mean that any future relationship will be based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. You'll need to earn my trust through consistent behavior over time, and there will be boundaries that protect both of us from falling back into old patterns." "I understand. What kind of boundaries? No requests for money, ever. No manipulation or guilt tactics. No using Sophia as leverage in our relationship. Regular therapy to maintain the progress you've made, and complete honesty about your life, your choices, and your motivations. Jessica nodded slowly. Those are fair boundaries. Mom, can I ask you something? What? How is Sophia? I've written to her several times, but she hasn't responded. Sophia is thriving. She's an extraordinary young woman who's building a life based on honesty and integrity. If and when she's ready to have a relationship with you, that will be her choice to make. I understand. I hope someday I'll have the opportunity to earn her forgiveness too. After Jessica left, Margaret and I debriefed about the meeting. What did you think of her presentation? Margaret asked. I think she's probably sincere about wanting to change, but I also think it's smart to proceed very cautiously. People can be genuinely remorseful while still being fundamentally unreliable. That's a very mature perspective. Are you planning to maintain contact with her? Maybe. Occasionally, with strict boundaries. But Margaret, I want to be clear about something. I don't need a relationship with Jessica to feel complete. If she proves herself to be trustworthy over time, that would be a nice bonus. But if she reverts to old patterns, I'm perfectly capable of cutting contact again without guilt or regret. That conversation with Margaret crystallized something important. For me, I had reached a point where family relationships were additions to my life rather than necessities. I could appreciate and enjoy connections with people who treated me well, but I no longer felt obligated to maintain relationships that were harmful or draining. 6 months later, I celebrated my 75th birthday surrounded by friends from my advocacy, work, neighbors from my retirement community, and Sophia, who was home for summer break before her senior year at Stanford. Jessica sent a card, a simple, thoughtful message, without any requests or manipulation. I appreciated the gesture, but felt no obligation to respond immediately or emotionally. Grandma, Sophia said as we reviewed the cards and gifts I had received, you seem really at peace with everything that's happened. I am at peace. I've learned that you can't control other people's choices, but you can control your response to those choices. I chose to respond to Jessica's betrayal by becoming stronger, more independent, and more purposeful. Do you ever regret exposing Mom and Dad? Never. What I regret is that it took me 70 years to learn that enabling destructive behavior isn't love. It's harm disguised as kindness. As I looked around at the people celebrating with me, genuine friends who valued my company, advocates who respected my work, a granddaughter who had become one of my dearest companions, I realized that Jessica's abandonment had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed being betrayed or because I wanted to see my daughter in prison, but because her cruelty had forced me to discover my own strength. At 75, I was finally living the life I had always deserved, a life based on mutual respect, authentic relationships, and purposeful work. I was no longer defined by my ability to serve other people's needs, but by my commitment to my own values and well-being. The woman who had been abandoned in a hospital bed had become a woman who would never again accept less than she deserved, from anyone, including family members. And that transformation, painful as it had been, was worth everything I had gone through to achieve it. Today, as I continue my advocacy work and enjoy my relationship with Sophia, I carry a simple message for other elderly people who might be experiencing financial exploitation. You are worthy of respect, honesty, and genuine love. You do not have to earn affection through financial sacrifice, and you do not have to accept manipulation in the name of family loyalty. It's never too late to choose yourself. I'm living proof of that truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.